welcome. I think we're maybe a minute or two early, but we're at passage, so we'll just start. Welcome to the 2023 Dewey Lecture in Law and Philosophy. We are delighted to welcome Professor Michele Moody-Adams as this year's lecturer. And before I introduce her, I want to share a little bit of background about this named lecture. The University of Chicago was founded on the idea, the University of Chicago Law School was founded on the idea that lawyers need to know more than just specific legal doctrines. The underpinnings of law and of lawmaking are a crucial component of a complete legal education. And therefore the concepts, the insights, the methods of other disciplines help this deeper understanding of law. And legal education within our university is properly interdisciplinary. And the Dewey Lecture highlights this commitment to the interdisciplinary approach to the study of law. In this lecture series, brings scholars to the law school to explore the philosophical foundations of law and lawmaking. Now, this series was started 40 years ago in honor of course, John Dewey. And Dewey's connections to the University of Chicago are many and deep. From the university's inception in 1894 until 1904, Dewey was the chair of our Department of Philosophy, and during that time, he was a leading philosopher of pragmatism, the intellectual movement that applied scientific methods to societal problems. And in addition, Dewey helped create the University of Chicago's laboratory school in 1896, and I note that that's even older than the law school itself. It is a vitally important part of our university that continues to flourish today. And in 1981, our then dean of the law school, Gerhard Casper, decided that the law school should recognize Dewey's ties to the universities and his contributions to legal theory. And Dean Casper began a correspondence with philosopher Sidney Hook, who was then the president of the John Dewey Foundation, about establishing a lectureship here at the law school in Dewey's name. And Hook readily agreed to help establish the Dewey Lectureship in jurisprudence, and since then, many esteemed philosophers have given the Dewey Lecture, including Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen, Ronald Dworkin, Ian Dutton, Richard Rorty, and our own Martha Nussbaum. In addition, John Rawls's famous paper, The Idea of Public Reason Revisited, was initially delivered as a Dewey Lecture and then was published in volume 64 of our law review. And the law school is especially delighted today to welcome our speaker, Professor Michele Moody-Adams. She is the Joseph Strauss Professor of Political Philosophy and Legal Theory at Columbia University. Her scholarly focus has been on equality and social justice, moral psychology and its virtues, and the philosophical implications of race and gender. She's the author of numerous articles in leading philosophy journals and numerous contributions to edited volumes. Her 1997 book, Fieldwork in Familiar Places, Morality, Culture, and Philosophy, is widely acclaimed. It considers skepticism about the objectivity of morality in a moment of persistent moral disagreements, and it tackles the assumptions of moral relativism and moral pessimism. It argues for taking moral disagreements seriously while still retaining an aspiration for moral objectivity. Professor Moody-Adams' most recent book, Making Space for Justice, Social Movements, Collective Imagination, and Political Hope, was published just last summer. And it examines social movements from abolitionism in the 19th century to Black Lives Matter today. And it examines how these movements pursue political action and at the same time pose crucial philosophical questions about the meaning of justice and how the demands for justice can be met. Now, in addition to her position at Columbia, Professor Moody-Adams has taught at many leading universities and colleges, Harvard, Wellesley, Rochester, Indiana, and Cornell. She received her undergraduate degree from Wellesley, plus a second undergraduate degree and an MA from Oxford, and a PhD in philosophy at Harvard. When she was a graduate student at Harvard, one of her faculty advisors was her own Professor Martha Nussbaum, and I know that Professor Nussbaum has followed her work with great admiration ever since. Now, I have to note, in addition to her extraordinary career as a scholar, Professor Moody-Adams has a parallel career as a university administrator. She has had numerous roles, including vice provost at Cornell, dean of the Columbia College, and vice president for undergraduate education, as well as having served chair of many committees, including her own department. Her lecture today will discuss reviving democracy, 21st century challenges. We are honored to welcome our 2023 Dewey lecturer, Professor Michele.
Thank you so much. I'll keep the preparatory remarks short, but I feel very much at home here, not just because of Professor Nussbaum's presence, but because many people I went to graduate school with are in the philosophy department here, and I grew up just a few minutes away, so it's a little bit like a bit of a homecoming. So I'm going to start here. Great, it seems to be working. Talking about reviving democracy, 21st century challenges. So in the concluding sentence to his 1939 essay, Creative Democracy, The Task Before Us, John Dewey offers an inspiring democratic vista, asserting that the task of democracy is that of creation of a freer and more humane experience in which all share and to which all contribute. And Dewey's claims confirm an insight that in making space for justice, I argue progressive social movements have shared with us since the mid-19th century, the insight that although liberty and equality are central democratic political virtues, are rather central to democratic morality, at its best, democracy will promote the values comprising what I call humane regard, which includes respect for our capacity for self-determination and concern for our vulnerability to suffering. Now, ironically, Dewey defended this inspiring, galvanizing ideal during an era of great uncertainty about whether democracy really had a future. As Jill Lepore, the historian, observed in the New Yorker 2020, it was a time in the late 1930s when, and I quote, democracy nearly died all over the world and all at once. How's that for anticipating a great title? More contemporary observers believe that democracy is once again in grave danger. And a compelling warning was sounded in the summer of 2016 when Roberto Foa and Yascha Mounk published an article exploring a set of trends suggesting the deconsolidation of democracy. And what is democratic deconsolidation? Really three main claims. Politicians are attacking democratic norms for partisan advantage. Anti-system parties emerge to destabilize the party system and political processes. And citizens who once accepted democracy have become more open to authoritarian alternatives. Consolidation of democracy is when there looks like there's no alternative. Now, drawing on the World Values Survey that they looked at from 1955 to 2014, Foa and Mounk argued that established liberal democracies were beset by several structural problems with the potential to produce widespread democratic breakdown, and they focused on developments that they thought transcended national borders, rejecting what was then an influential view that the most urgent challenges facing democracies could be traced primarily to local causes. They went on to insist that the global problems they identified actually posed an existential threat to democracy itself. Three problems identified by Foa and Mounk remain especially concerning. The first is that partisan disagreement is too easily exploited for anti-democratic purposes, and they worry that it's not something about the institutions themselves, but about the way we're using them. Controversy and disagreement are inevitable in any human community, certainly any complex modern society, but in many democracies, partisan politics can transform the simplest disagreement into a dangerously polarizing political impasse. But second, they found reliable data of a steep decline in citizen trust of democratic institutions and practices, and this was a global problem, not just local. Thirdly, they found that virtually every established democracy, there was a sharp decline, a steep decline in citizen commitment to democratic norms and values. And I'll say that some of the worst and most troubling evidence was that the decline was actually more intense, much steeper amongst the youngest citizens of established democracies, and this is particularly troubling. So I remain cautiously optimistic that contemporary democracies can constructively address these problems, though this will obviously require a great deal of effort and determination. I also believe that three principles that ought to shape our efforts to revive 21st century democracy are actually implicit in several insights articulated by Dewey in the first part of the 20th century. So in Creative Democracy, for instance, Dewey addresses the polarizing tendencies of partisan politics, and he actually argues that a stable democracy is one that can produce multiple forums in which, quote, disputes, controversies, and conflicts can proceed as cooperative undertakings, end quote. And by this, he simply meant they're disputes in which each party learns by giving other parties the chance to express themselves, instead of one party trying to forcefully suppress the other. Additionally, in The Public and Its Problems, I'll say a little bit about this later, from 1927, Dewey anticipates the problem of citizen distrust. And he notes in that work that even in complex modern democracies, ordinary citizens need appropriate opportunities to inform the work of experts and political elites. And they should be able to expect that their convictions are taken seriously. And here, Dewey is actually resisting the claims of a very interesting thinker named Walter Lippmann, a journalist and a sort of public philosopher in addition, in a book called Public Opinion from 1922, in which Dewey said what we really need to make democracy work well is governance by a machinery of expert knowledge. In democratic democracy, Dewey will have none of this. But thirdly, in creative democracy, Dewey acknowledges the dangers of citizen disaffection with democratic norms and habits of mind. And he's going to go on to insist that democracy has to be understood as an individual way of life, not just an instrument for the satisfaction of aggregated preferences. Now, my aim in discussing these insights from Dewey, these three insights, is not to offer an interpretation or even a broad defense of Dewey's broader democratic theory. Rather, I simply want to explore the 21st century implications of important principles implicit in his insights. So Dewey teaches us that stable democracies must meet three jointly necessary conditions. The first, they need to provide more opportunities for what he calls amicable cooperation. I'll say something about that in these remarks. Second, they must incorporate in their decision-making process robust partnerships between ordinary citizens on the one hand and their experts and political elites on the other. This he talks about at great length in Public and Its Problems. Finally, he thinks, and this is kind of spread out throughout the work, they need to secure a widely shared sense of political solidarity, a strongly motivating sense that people are valued members of a worthwhile community of shared interests and values. And Dewey understood that this was not going to be an easy task. He knew it was a daunting task. And I would add that it's even more challenging in a world threatened by climate change, epistemic insularity, and social mistrust, uncertainty about the implications of emerging technology, and persistent economic inequality. But I think Dewey's right that democracy will not survive unless we are ready to attempt to carry out the task. So creating and preserving solidarity is going to be one of the most important parts of this task. I'll talk most about that at the end. This is, as Charles Taylor says, because the very existence of a democratic people as a so-called demos depends upon the mobilization of political concern and action around a group identity. I've argued elsewhere that in a large multicultural, complex democracy, it has to be an open identity, has to respect internal diversity, and allow recognition of obligations that transcend borders, but it still has to be solidarity around an identity. And it can't be a fixed or static achievement, but it has to be an ongoing national project of constituting and reconstituting identity over time. So I've actually argued in a separate essay that democratic politics is actually always, of necessity, identity politics. But sustaining democratic solidarity requires that most citizens appreciate the normative basis of democratic citizenship. As Dewey says, quote, "Powerful enemies of democracy can be successfully met only by the creation of deep-seated personal attitudes in individual human beings." And so I'll urge at the end of these remarks that a kind of robust democratic civic ethos is necessary to aid in the stability of contemporary democracies. And that three of the most important virtues in that ethos are civic sacrifice, civic trust, and what I call civic grace, which I'll explain near the end. So now we come to section 1. Dewey believed that properly designed democratic institutions could allow us to take nearly every conflict, in his words, out of the atmosphere of the medium of force, or even of violence as a means of settlement, and move it into what he called the discussion and intelligence. To value democracy for Dewey, I'll quote from him, democracy is to value amicable cooperation. Democracy is the belief, even when needs and ends or consequences are different for each individual, the habit of amicable cooperation, which may include, as in sport, rivalry and competition, is itself a priceless addition to life. We must begin with this conception of democratic conflict as necessarily valuable only when it's amicable cooperation. So I'm going to say something about what the nature and sources of conflict look like and how we ought to understand them, and what kinds of outcomes constitute rationally appropriate responses to conflict. So cultivating the habit of amicable cooperation. So on the matter of the nature and sources of conflict, scholars in peace and conflict studies remind us that serious conflicts are almost never just disputes about a single immediate issue. This is especially true when the conflict has persisted over a long period of time, and even more when attempts to settle the conflict have sometimes involved efforts to suppress disagreement or some other kind of coercion and even violence to force an end to the conflict. For instance, the conflict about abortion is rarely, if ever, just about the moral and legal status of the fetus. It presumes disagreements about gender roles, about the meaning and value of individual autonomy, and about what constitutes a defensible balance between rights and responsibilities, and even the authority of religious doctrine. But a similarly complex set of disagreements is framing recent discussions about what texts and ideas to teach K through 12 students in the classroom in the United States. This is like such a lively conflict going on at the moment. And I think three background disagreements are relevant here. First of all, do K through 12 teachers know how to constructively negotiate the permeable boundary between trauma and truth? Right? Some of the things we need to teach kids are actually really quite traumatic. But how do you negotiate the boundary? Do they know how? Should school students, secondly, be expected to contemplate events which might produce feelings of shame and guilt? This is a major source of disagreement in these debates. And then thirdly, is the teaching of texts such as Toni Morrison's Beloved or Martin Luther King's Letter from Birmingham Jail an attempt to promote justice, or as some critics have said in recent months, just an effort at self-righteous and allegedly anti-white shaming? This is the debate that's ongoing, right? So, until we address the complex network of disagreements that frame such contemporary discussions about school curricula, we have no hope of transforming these discussions into opportunities for constructive reflection or change. And now I want to take us to the question of what amicable cooperation might look like. I'm going to give you a little bit of suspense in the next few minutes, so hold your horses and I will give you more answers. What might amicable cooperation look like? Sorry, whoops, what did I just do? There we go, let's hold on. So on the matter of rationally appropriate responses to conflict, it's often assumed that the ideally rational conclusion to a conflict is convergence on some one position about what to feel, believe, or do. It is Stanley Cavell insisted, when he's talking about the shortcomings of emotivism in moral theory, that there clearly are times when it's entirely rational to agree to disagree. Now, in some cases, you can only prevent this from turning into something other than amicable disagreement if you ensure that people have space, I mean physical and cultural space, within which they can comfortably continue to disagree. One example, if a company has several employees who are required by their religions to avoid pork, and some of its employees are not, they can do the best by their employees by equipping the company kitchen with 2 microwave ovens, right? One that has to remain pork-free as a means of respectfully keeping the peace. I recognize, and Cavell, as Dewey would recognize, that every conflict can't be managed this way. Many political conflicts in particular require settling on a policy that ends the conflict by choosing one position over all others. For instance, the current debate about whether the US should have a debt ceiling, so to speak, or not, is going to be resolved by what theorists of organizational behavior call domination of one position over competing views. That's part of what makes it such a terribly challenging conflict. But as thinkers as varied as Edmund Burke in the 18th century and Amy Gutman and Dennis Thomas in the 20th have said, a willingness to settle political conflicts through compromise can be an expression of rationality and an important support of political cooperation. As Burke expressed it, we must often be ready, and I quote, to balance inconveniences, I love that phrase, and to give and take in support of meaningful cooperation. And I've argued elsewhere that the most democratically defensible form of compromise is something I called principled compromise. It has 3 elements. It should emerge from a process that maximizes transparency. Any sacrifice it requires should minimize harm and promote mutual respect. And it should seek to improve the status quo in ways most likely to increase democratic cooperation. So I think there should be more of these for amicable cooperation. And I think that regrettably, some of the most consequential compromises in modern history have not been principled compromises. 3 of the most problematic that are still shaping political controversies are 3 of the compromises that produced the US Constitution. The Great Compromise that allowed large and small states to have the same number of senators, the Electoral College Compromise, which I think is deliberately a complete refusal of democratic decision making, and then the 3/5 compromise that denied both the legal personhood, full legal personhood, and the humanity of enslaved persons. None of these compromises were really meant to minimize harm, promote mutual respect, or embody core principles of democratic political morality. By contrast, if you want an example of a principled compromise, read the letter from Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King. In that letter, there is a passage in which he proposes a path to the leaders of Birmingham, Alabama, toward desegregation that would allow everybody to save a little face. It was a principled compromise. That's what makes me so sad, frankly, that even though there are people who say, oh, I love Martin Luther King and we love the letter from Birmingham jail, but we can't let our kids read it because it makes them feel bad. It's one of the best examples of principled compromise that you can ever find. And in fact, it's not just principled compromise. It reminds us of something Dewey argued in Human Nature and Conduct. This is 1922. I quote, conflict is the gadfly of thought. This is right, the very Socratic notion of conflict. It instigates to invention, it shocks us out of sheep-like passivity, it's a sine qua non of reflection and ingenuity. So when they're not reading the King's letter, they're missing out on many things. Now, we learned from Mary Parker Follett, who was a pioneering theorist of organizational behavior, that even at its best, even a principled compromise is somewhat middling. It falls between domination on one end and something she called integrative consensus on the other. Integrative consensus being where parties find a solution in which their most important desires are satisfied, so they don't really feel like they're sacrificing anything. And she thought that was the best solution, but of course it's the hardest one to get in politics. And I'll say that, interestingly, over the last 2 decades, scholars of peace and conflict studies have suggested maybe it's more important to at least aim for integrative consensus than we thought. Indeed, oh, sorry, I don't want that quite yet. Indeed, in an influential little book he calls the Little Book of Conflict Transformation, peace studies, conflict studies scholar named John Paul Lederach urges that the best approach to serious and sustained conflict is what he calls constructive conflict transformation. The question to ask is not how do we reach agreement on a way to just end the conflict, but how do we agree on an end to the conflict that leaves space to create something constructive and mutually desirable. Now, like many contemporary theorists, Lederach, there's a title of the book, like many contemporary theorists, he labels such projects conflict transformation rather than the more familiar language conflict resolution, and people disagree about whether there's anything new there. I think there is, at least in his case, because if you read this work amongst others, he tells you that the kind of conflict transformation he's hoping for focuses on the role of imagination in helping disputing parties find a path to integrative consensus. To do so, they have to come to see themselves and the network of social relations of which they are part in a new way. And actually, this echoes Dewey's stance, I'll leave that there. This echoes Dewey's stance in his approach to democratic discourse, as one of Dewey's, I think, more interesting interpreters, a man named William Caspary, has argued, that Dewey assumes that we can't settle difficult political conflicts by consensus on rational principles alone, contrary then to the model of democratic discourse that reaches its apotheosis in John Rawls's political liberalism. It turns out that for Dewey, democratic disagreement can be settled only through what he calls open-ended inquiry that hopefully leads, and here's his language, to transformation of the situation and correlatively of the self. Most often in Liberalism and Social Action, which dates from 1935, Dewey expresses some details of this view, and he writes of the need to bring deep conflicts out into the open. So don't stop talking about it, talk more, but talk in the right way, so that they might be settled, here I quote again, in the interest of the widest possible contribution to the interests of all, end quote. Now, Lederach believes that at their most effective, appeals to imagination in the context of conflict transformation can actually reveal a path to reconciliation between disputing and even formerly warring parties. And he knows, because he's helped create these reconciliation projects again and again. The sources of this belief in reconciliation for him are complex, as with the thought of Martin Luther King, who also talks about reconciliation. There is a very powerful reliance on their religious commitments, but actually Lederach's stance turns out to be very much in the spirit of Dewey's secular confidence that partisan conflicts can sometimes be transformed in the service of peaceful reconciliation. And I submit, I've thought a lot about this particular example in many contexts. I think that Nelson Mandela's efforts to avoid a full-scale civil war and then create institutional structures to promote truth and reconciliation, as South Africa made its transition to democracy, are about a textbook, the closest you get to a textbook example of true constructive conflict transformation. I will conclude with a few observations about Mandela as well. But one challenge, of course, for any attempt to reach constructive transformation of conflict is that it doesn't work well in ordinary electoral politics. Most important, electoral politics have to end in a victory for one side or another, one contestant over all others. And I'll add that I think in the contemporary US, maybe less so in other countries, the kind of unrelenting demand to raise campaign funds basically all the time encourages active politicians to maintain extreme positions in order to satisfy their donors and other supporters who constitute their so-called base. So I don't think we can count on active politicians to help us, at least at the start of this effort, I think we're going to have to look for leadership outside the realm of political contestation for anything like this to become larger scale. And I suggest, I try to give suggestions always, that we can begin by encouraging leaders of nonprofit foundations, concerned think tanks, some religious organizations, to convene a network of forums that would allow people to convert normally polarizing conflicts into opportunities for constructive transformation. They could be moderated by people like you, right? Lawyers, social workers, psychologists, and of course scholars and practitioners of peace and conflict studies. I think the forums could sometimes take advantage of existing structures. I was thinking about whether there are any such structures in my hometown here of Chicago. There are these boards and commissions that come out of the mayor's office, but they're all appointed by one person, so they may not feel as broad-based as they ought to. In New York City, where I live now, there are 59 community boards that are actually, the members of whom are appointed by borough presidents, so there's a little bit more spreading of responsibility for populating the boards. They don't get paid. They serve, to try to promote concerns in their local neighborhoods. They might be encouraged on these boards to take up some of these efforts at conflict transformation. I acknowledge that at some point it would have to have a national dimension. It'd have to have national forums to reflect on the most important outcomes. You might ask me, well, is there any real appetite for this? Jill Lepore, in that article I quote the very first paragraph of my talk, actually says in the late 1930s, during the height of the Depression in the US, large numbers of people actually engaged in serious conversation about how to preserve democracy. Here I'll quote from her. They did so in legislatures, over the radio, at the luncheon table, in the drawing rooms, at meetings and forums of all kinds of groups of citizens everywhere. And I actually, if you're interested in this, I'd encourage you to go look at that article of hers from The New Yorker in January 2020. 3 caveats. First, these discussions will be effective only if they include a significant in-person, face-to-face component. Social media communication, as you all know, rarely encourages very much responsibility for the consequences of communication, and social media provides just too many echo chambers and filter bubbles to provide robust forums for approaching conflict constructively. Second, a significant portion of the exchanges that take place in these forums should be devoted to confronting disputes about how to understand national history. Some of the most polarizing conflicts are about our understandings of the past. And thirdly, there should be opportunities for people to share their so-called deep stories. This is Arlie Hochschild's language from Strangers in Their Own Land. But they're going to have to be expected for this to go well to test their deep stories against the facts of history. So, section 2. Strengthening civic trust by managing or enhancing communication. Dewey would remind us that the destructive force of political conflict isn't the only important challenge. Equally significant is striking a balance between expertise and citizen input to affirm the value of democratic self-determination. If you know Walter Lippmann's book, Public Opinion, you know there that he actually thought people who defended democracy spent too much time talking about the source of decisions rather than the quality of the exercise of the power of making decision. And that's why he argued for this machinery of expert knowledge. Dewey will have none of this. He does not think we can trust the insulated expert to get everything right. And he, in fact, in The Public and Its Problems, talks about the need to limit epistemic insularity. Here's my favorite quote on this. The man who wears the shoe knows best that it pinches and where it pinches, even if the expert shoemaker is the best judge of how the trouble is to be remedied. And I think the recent water crisis in Flint, Michigan is one of the best examples of this. 3 of the problems at stake in that case are failure of deliberative inclusivity, a consistent lack of institutional transparency, and vehement refusals to think that the people of Flint knew where the shoe pinched. They would say, this water is awful, and I've got my child is sicker, and there's Legionnaire's disease in great rates, and they would say, it's all in your head. And at some point when you show your distaste and distrust of the people, their trust of you will diminish as well. Now, it might be thought that we can address the dangers of epistemic distancing through greater reliance on such projects as deliberative citizen assemblies. This is where people get together, they're given information, and they're given the opportunity to think about and decide, or at least contribute to decisions on public policy. But the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson has suggested that maybe even this wouldn't be enough, because maybe we need to reconfigure the institutions that help to create epistemic insularity in the first place. And she reminds us that elites and experts are actually educated in one set of institutions, like the one that you here and the one I teach in, right, and one that we went to graduate school in. And very often the people whose needs are being served by their expertise are educated elsewhere. This starts the epistemic distancing early on, and she says we may need to remedy that. But I think we can also ask whether the epistemic insularity doesn't actually have epistemic dangers even apart from that. Is it possible, for instance, that sometimes the expert knows less than she or he needs to know to develop, say, a sustainable policy solution? The global health expert, health advocate, Paul Farmer, wonderful essay in this book, To Repair the World, it's called Accompaniment as Policy, says what we need to do is actually pay more attention to the person in need of help, because they know not just what the problem is, they know often what will allow a solution to be long-lasting. Accompaniment, he says, is often about sticking with a task until it's deemed completed by the person being accompanied rather than by the accompagnateur. It's easy to be dismissive of accompaniment as policy in a world in which arcane expertise advances the answer to every problem, but expertise alone, he says, will not solve the problems. And it's a brilliant essay. He's got some anti-Weberian sentiments going in there about too much worry about rationality or rationalizing processes and not enough about human input. You may say to me, oh, well, that's fine for the foreign policy realm. You may say, well, if he's working in Rwanda or in Haiti, that's one thing, but what about the US? I can tell you, as somebody growing up in this city, in this neighborhood, that it was the failure of accompaniment, or excuse me, of policy to seek accompaniment that actually produced some of the worst urban policy making in America possible. Let's come up with a solution, throw money at it, and then we walk away. This kind of doing policy at a distance, I think he's right, is not going to work. And I'll add that one of the greatest successes in foreign policy is one that people think could be translated quite easily to the domestic context. That's the work that his group Partners in Health did to help Rwanda become the first nation in sub-Saharan Africa to meet the health-related goals of the UN Millennium Development Initiative. You know, there is a way to apply his insights in domestic settings, maybe using some of those forums I've just talked about earlier and thinking about the partnerships we could create between ordinary people and their experts. So I think it's not something we necessarily need to write off. I'll just transition to the next section. Institutional virtues that are likely to promote civic trust are deliberative inclusivity, institutional transparency, and the third one from Paul Farmer, respect for citizen testimony. Now, I've asked what happens when we overestimate the value of ceding too much power to experts. But to build on Elizabeth Anderson's worry, is there something about the epistemic quality, the sufficiency or insufficiency of what gets produced that also matters? Think of cases, I'll give you a very famous recent case in January of 2021. It turns out that insularity, epistemic distance, sometimes leads people to act on racial, ethnic, and class prejudices. In January 2021, the American Psychiatric Association conceded the existence of just such prejudice. They often had no interaction except in sort of professional settings with people of color, and they would make judgments that, in fact, here I'll quote what they say, from the beginnings of American psychiatry, the profession created structures of misinterpretation, unequal treatment, and unequal access to treatment that not only affected how marginalized and stigmatized groups were understood, but helped to support local and national policies that limited and constrained their freedom and undermined their quality of life. So some greater interaction between ordinary people and the experts might have helped to produce. They actually issued a very major public apology on their website. Then there are other kinds of epistemic prejudices that come from insularity. Sometimes it's insularity that keeps one group of experts from the other. During the COVID-19 crisis, well, I say during some of the worst of it, there were experts in epidemiology, public health epidemiology, refusing to listen to engineers who understood about the transmission of particles in the air. And they would actually say to them in meetings on the World Health Organization and the CDC, they would tell these physicists and engineers who understood aerosol science, oh, shut up, you don't know what you're saying. And of course, some of what they were saying was exactly what we needed to know about how the virus was transmitted. Much smaller particles of transmission than the CDC and WHO really realized. And the problem is seeing even other expert communities as outsiders ends up showing us that something is lacking in the way people's inquiry and research is being carried out. So I think that this example, I can give others later in the questions time, this example helps make the case that we need a new conception of expertise on which expert communities have essentially permeable boundaries, but also in which they've got to show us that their work embodies certain epistemic virtues. What virtues matter most? Transparency about the limits of current knowledge, humility in relation to past harms, accountability, and trustworthiness. And the trustworthiness part is, for me, interesting. It requires that expert communities spend a lot of time reminding us of the successes they've had along with the past harms they've helped to produce as a consequence of lack of knowledge. And I like to argue that the best way of carrying this out would be for government agencies, or maybe even clusters of agencies that work on similar domains, to create something analogous to nonprofit boards of directors. I've served on a few of those, and I know that sometimes what you're doing is you're asking the group you serve on the board for, help me understand how your processes work, and what could we do to help you make them better. Sometimes you're just looking for understanding, for transparency. That's the first one. But then you also want to know that they're actually thinking about doing what they've done in the past, about doing it better. And I argue that the boards ought to be tasked with producing public summaries of the reports they have, citizen boards that interact, initially getting the one-way transmission of information, possibly a feedback loop developing over time. I would add that the accountability issue is most important for a group of people that Michael Lipsky, the sociologist, has called street-level bureaucrats. These are the people who are the first line of interaction when you interact in some way with the government, policemen being one of the central components of street-level bureaucracy. And no failure of street-level bureaucracy does more to undermine citizen trust than failures of accountability, transparency, and I'll say humane regard that have characterized some of the activities of police departments in the past. I'm not for defunding, I'm for reshaping the way the practice is carried out. Taken together, I think you could create a series of institutional structures in a very Deweyan model that would have one overarching goal. That would be ensuring that expert communities treat ordinary citizens as partners. Partners in framing problems, devising solutions, but in affirming the epistemic integrity of expert recommendations and practices. And I add that I think the experts actually have more to gain here even than ordinary citizens do. The temptation to make these charges that experts are clueless or unaccountable or even corrupt would be lessened if people were on these nonprofit boards having a kind of interaction that ensured a lot more confidence. So now I turn to my final section, how to make democracy a way of life. And here I'm just going to quote Dewey without summarizing him and let him body forth for you. We must, he says, realize in thought and act that democracy is a personal way of individual life, that it signifies the possession and continual use of certain attitudes, forming personal character and determining desire and purpose in all the relations of life. What does this mean? For Dewey, it means that we need to see ourselves and our self-understandings as deeply shaped by the democracies of which we are citizens. I submit that we can also articulate a set of democratic virtues that capture what Dewey is after: civic sacrifice, civic trust, and civic grace. And I will conclude my remarks now, a few bit of remarks about what these mean and how to develop them in the 21st century context. Now, you see civic sacrifice, immediately several people are going to object. 3 objections are most likely. One of them is, how is this consistent, civic sacrifice, with individual liberty, if this is what you're asking me to do? Secondly, isn't it incompatible, this demand for civic sacrifice, with the respect for pluralism? And thirdly, won't it always involve a veiled commitment to a kind of militarism that can be dangerous locally and globally? I can show you that none of those objections succeed. First, on the militarism issue, far beyond the demands of war, virtually every well-designed, smoothly functioning democracy demands major sacrifices every day of our lives, right? That have nothing to do with the demands of war. If you respect the rule of law, you've got to be ready to accept or at least meet with peaceful protest the fact that guilty people sometimes go free and innocent are sometimes convicted. If you want to preserve democratic electoral processes, you've got to be ready to accept, and this can feel like a sacrifice, that when your side loses out, you continue to support the institutions anyway. You might want to reform them, but you might want to support them. And a third example, if you want to meet the demands of liberal toleration, of individuality and difference, you're consistently expected to stop interfering with other people just because they don't agree with you. That's a sacrifice. I'm not going to tell you this on my case over and over. And I will say that Judith Sklar once made, I think, the most helpful observation in this context, that toleration consistently applied, this is her phrase, is more difficult and morally more demanding than repression. So sacrifice is clearly really very critical to democratic life. But sacrifice can't be separated from trust. The political theorist Eric Alzner has developed a theory of what he calls generalized trust, and claims he has data to show that increasing polarization is leading to a steep decline of this trust, especially in democracies. He says part of it is the rise of economic inequality, so there's a little bit of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the background here. And he actually says that, in fact, where economic inequality is low, citizens have a stronger sense of shared trust. He also has identified lately certain geographical phenomena that add to our tendency to experience civic distrust. This reminds us a bit of some arguments from Elizabeth Anderson around the problem of segregation. Maybe it's separation that makes people mistrust each other. At any rate, Alzner has shown that economic inequality, segregation of people in different groups, encourages civic mistrust. But I want to end, as I get closer to ending, with a little bit of an example. This is a picture of a town called Protection, Kansas, which in 1957 gathered in 498 people in their population, all gathered in the high school gym to receive polio shots on Polio Protection Day. And they held a parade to celebrate that being the first town to be fully inoculated against polio. If you were to go there now, you'd see they have a little plaque they've erected to this. It turns out that in January of 2021, a 71-year-old man who was interviewed talking about his participation in this said he thought they all did it because they felt they could trust each other to come together to try to do something good. And he went on, this wonderful interview that appeared on the NPR website, to say that in 2021, January 2021, a large percentage of protection Kansas residents didn't believe that COVID-19 was real. They thought it was invented by the government so they could be injected with a polio vaccine, in quotes, that contained a microchip to track their movements. What happened? Right? What happened was not just that they stopped trusting experts, but they stopped trusting themselves. There's a political theorist named Arkan Fong who's argued that we live in a post-expert democracy, and that's the trouble. That's part of the trouble. Obviously, if you think you're being injected with a microchip when you go to get a vaccine, that's a problem. But the real problem is that they don't trust each other. And there's no easy crisis to this, there's no easy solution, rather, to this crisis of civic trust. But I think an important part of the solution is what I've come to call civic grace. And there are two aspects to civic grace. One is a readiness to relinquish resentment. That should be an and rather than a comma there. And bitterness, and to resist demonizing the other. And this is critical and crucial to the survival of democracy. Jane Mansbridge has argued, and I'm going to quote from her, that she's a political theorist at Harvard, even if political partisans do not see one another as enemies, or rather, even if they do see each other as enemies, it's important to realize that enemies can negotiate, and that they can and must negotiate to keep even basic government going. And this is part of the little website she's developed around helping people learn negotiating skills, even in the context of deep disagreement. She actually says negotiation is a teachable skill. But civic grace has a second, more constructive dimension. This is, and it's a notion that I've come to think is critical to democratic societies surviving. It's a readiness to seek substantive shared goals and to formulate political ideals. And I think we can do this even when we still see the other side as an enemy. But what this does is this makes us open to the possibility of reconciliation, of constructive conflict transformation. And here I come back to an example that I gave earlier, and that's Nelson Mandela. When Mandela gave his famous speech at the Rivonia trial in 1964, he vigorously defended his reliance on violence to resist the evils of South African apartheid. He spent 27 years in jail because of it. Quote, "I've cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It's an ideal which I hope to live for and an end to achieve. But if needs be, it's an ideal for which I am prepared to die," end quote. But in 1990, so from 64 to 90, upon his release from prison, Mandela renounced violence to enable a peaceful transition to democracy. And in fact, in the Making Space for Justice book, I contend that this is personal evolution. It was an extraordinary expression of moral heroism and civic grace. And that realization of civic grace in South African politics, especially the National Project of Reconciliation, was a major contribution to democratic theory. And I'll add that it's powerful evidence that we have the capacity to meet the challenges of the 21st century. You know, we can't succeed even if we rest on our laurels. I can say a little bit more later about how the economic, political, and social upheaval in South Africa tells us that you rest on your laurels and all the good things that one person produced sort of disappear. It's also true that democracies must sometimes be prodded, as Dewey suggests, and shocked out of their sheep-like passivity, and that's what social movements often do. But whatever the source of the inspiration to change, democracy might have a future only if we lessen polarizing conflict, strengthen trust in democratic institutions, and encourage civic grace as a path to robust civic trust. Thank you so much. Questions? Yes, Professor Nussbaum.
Yeah, let me try to do my best. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
I agree with everything you said, and I think it was a wonderful lecture. But Mandela emphasized that it's not just a one-time thing to say relinquish resentment. He had to work on himself, but it was a profound, as he said, it took most of his 27 years in prison to get on top of his own inclination to strike back and to try to penalize the enemy. And King emphasized much the same thing.
Absolutely.
So then the question is, how do you do that? You can see how it can take place in a very disciplined political movement like Mandela's or King. You can see how it can take place in a religious group or even in families. But how on the political scale? How do you encourage? How would you take the Chicago City Council and get them into the inner work and this emotional discipline that's necessary in order to engage in constructive conflict and transformation?
Everything you said at the start, I also completely agree with. It isn't a one-time process. You know, I'll get back to the how do you make it work. When the Amish in the nickel mines, Pennsylvania, 1995 or 6, when they had 8 or 9 of their young, school girls shot to death in a school, they acknowledged that they had to keep working. That was forgiveness, not so much the transition of this kind, but anything that involves this kind of personal transformation, realized on a political scale. It is an ongoing project, and people will falter. How is it possible? I think a version of those forums for conflict transformation that I talked about at the end of the first section, where people would have to sit down with each other. It's not necessarily to produce a policy outcome, but to ask what would it mean to create a context in which policy is debated that doesn't immediately turn into partisan name-calling and demonizing. It will not happen with politicians as the first line of action. It has to come from us. And I can tell you one interesting thing. Sometimes as academic leaders, one of the examples, I was wondering if someone would ask me about civic grace. We need more exemplars in places where people don't feel beholden to partisan politics. Leaders of academic institutions. Head of Georgetown, and then I'll stop. In '94, when one of the Georgetown law students, I'm so glad this example came to my head, was on television testifying in front of Congress about why health care coverage in a university should cover contraception. There were a bunch of commentators, talking heads, who went after her personally because they didn't agree with the policy. And he said, look, this is not how civil discourse should be carried out. You disagree with her, particularly if you're Catholic and she's Catholic and you're telling her, she's telling you to do something you disagree with, but you don't have to name call. He even said Augustine did not support that kind of error in civic discourse. So what we need is people outside of politics. Yes, Liam.
Yeah, just returning
One of my fellow former students.
one of my favorite classes. Just returning to the point on compromise, and I can only speak on this from the perspective of an Asian American, but it seems like the history and story of Asian Americans in this country just feels defined by compromise.
I know.
And you get to a moment like COVID-19, frankly, it was a scary time. So I guess my question is, how do you navigate sort of the pursuit of the idea of compromise with this feeling of enough is enough?
Wow. Now that's an extraordinary question. It's actually one that I take up in a very small passage in Making Space for Justice, because in fact, Asian Americans were often used as a foil to for African Americans. All those African Americans are always whining, and here are those wonderful Asian Americans who never complain. And of course, neither claim was right, but it ended up using Asian Americans, and it ended up creating political context in which the only way they could be heard was to be heard by being willing to compromise. And then of course it backfires, it blows up in their faces in 2020, 2019. It's a balance. Principal compromise is a wonderful thing. Constructive conflict transformation is too. But I think I won't say what Lederach thinks, but many people who prefer peaceful reconciliation would not deny that the world might have been horribly different if we hadn't fought the Axis powers in World War II, the Allied forces against the Axis. There'd be a lot of people not alive, and a lot of people leading lives of desperation. Civil war, sometimes, I mean, I am actually more of a pacifist than I'm letting on here, but sometimes the balance, unfortunately, doesn't favor these peaceful projects. My hope, however, is that more peaceful projects, rather than not, will actually make the violent solutions look less acceptable. I actually believe Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stepan and also Jean Sharp are three thinkers who tell you that, in fact, the collectively most rational form of political action for social groups turns out to be nonviolence over time. I hope that answered your question. Yeah, and then I'll come to this side, just one more on this side.
So I'm just curious, so when you're talking about like democratic distrust and developed democracies, it's always, I would say mostly it's in the context of federalism. So in the US you have state and federal government. In the EU you have national governments and then the EU government. So I'm just curious, does federalism enable or impede the processes you're talking about? Because is it breaking into smaller political communities where, from public choice we think it's easier, it lessens the collective action problem, or is it actually complicating it in a way? So I'm just curious, what do you think about federalism?
That's a fascinating question. I'm not sure that I have a comprehensive answer, because I think it depends on political culture as much as on institutional structures and constitutional design. If a political culture in a federalist system could support greater attention to these virtues than in a non-federalist system, but it would depend upon political culture. And there, I haven't thought deeply enough about the elements of that. That's a fascinating question. Thank God. Nobody's ever asked me that in this context. So on this side, yeah.
Just with regard to specifically strengthening trust in democratic institutions, kind of the theme of caring about government and individual people care. To what extent do you think there's an issue in America that our government doesn't necessarily do a lot of things for a lot of people and does not give people tangible things? And to what degree do you think these goals that you articulate can be advanced by the government? Essentially, maybe the dismay of some, getting much more involved in people's lives and people having much more of a stake in the benefits of things.
Wow, it's a fascinating question. Does government do enough for us to understand? I'm going to give you a complicated answer. I actually think that in the American context, unlike societies that have very robust welfare state arrangements, a lot of what the government does is actually kind of silent. And Social Security, even though it is it's a transfer payment program. And it's funny that sometimes people, I won't mention what political part of the spectrum they're on, will say, oh, I hate the government, but don't take my Social Security. How is that possible? So here's the thing. Government needs to be more intentional in settings like that about saying, here's something good we did for you. I'm not sure that this makes a difference, but I understand the anger of the people in Ohio right now who were in the place where the train derailed. It seems like nobody cares or gives a darn about them. This morning on the Times, in the headline, I saw it said, Biden wants you to know I'm with you. That's one way, but you can't just say you're with you. You've got to do. And what the government does goes under the radar because it's taken for granted as part of the fabric. There has to be more intentional discussion of it. No one should be able to say, I hate government, but don't take mine. Or you shouldn't be able to think that's rational, but don't take my Social Security. Don't touch my money.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, yeah.
I wonder how you think. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, go ahead. Ian and I will see each other later.
Great. I wonder how you think about media institutions in your sort of framework here. So it seems like a lot of people are willing to come to the table and reduce polarization, but are coming to the table with different information and different sources of truth. And it seems like that's a large sort of driver of why people are not able to sort of reach the constructive compromise that you talk about and avoid sort of partisan name calling. So I wonder how you think about media factoring into sort of the framework that you've laid out.
It's everything. Both for the way it doesn't just deprive of information, but provides misinformation. And if you create these forums for constructive discussion, this is why the theorists of deliberative democracy insist on there being a component that's about information. Many of the days they're there, 2 or 3 days out of a week, say, might need to be spent getting the facts straight. And learning to trust some sources rather than others. That's going to be and there's no magic bullet to that. The New York Times can get things wrong too, right? So you've got to be willing to understand how to inquire. It's not about DY, what is it, DYR, do your own, DYOR. It's not about do your own research. It's about learn which sources are worth investing confidence in. And then comparing the information from those trustworthy sources, because even trustworthy sources can get it wrong. I'm a long-winded person, as you can tell. Thank you so much.